The night belongs to us. We will bathe in their blood and relish their screams.
Hi everybody, welcome to the video. My name is Mark White. I'm the former project lead and managing director for Southampton Vampire by Night. In this video I'm really excited to talk about player versus player in games and why it was so important to us on the project, and also some of the mistakes that we made during the process that inevitably caused us a load of work, etc., which wasn't exactly needed. So I start by saying the importance of player versus player. I'm definitely in the camp of I hate kumbaya games. At the same time, I also hate games that contain overpowered bully-like players. They're basically the veteran players that have played in it for years, got buttloads of XP, loads of resources. You come in and they can just squash you in seconds. And at the same time, I'm just not keen on those games where everybody just sits around helping each other, holding hands, and there's no conflict at all, because I find those games are, a little bit too, they're dull. So what we were trying to do was to implement PvP and make it a core aspect of our game, and do it in a way where there were checks and balances. And what I mean by checks and balances, that if for any reason one of the factions or a player was to start to gain a lot of power, and it meant that the other faction or players were struggling, finding it hard that they couldn't compete or have no plan at all to be able to take that individual faction down, there was things in the game to help balance things out. Now, I took this from playing a game years ago, I think it was called Warhammer Online, and it was the first game that I came across that had, when you went into world PvP in a way, there was three distinct, well, not factions, but camps that you would be assigned to, one of the three. And it meant that if one of those camps was to ever start to gain a lot of power and take over the map, the other two factions camps could join together and would then outnumber the dominant player or players, and then able to strip some resources back, and then it would keep on moving around the map who was in power at any time. Now that was relying on the players working together, which would normally be in competition. So in a LARP, that can be difficult. But it was that idea of, okay, three camps, three groups, three factions, that was important to us. So we basically had the game split between, when you start your character, you could choose to be in the Camarilla or the Sabbat, and you would have two separate games. So a Camarilla court would take place on 1 month, and the Sabbat court would take place the following month. So each faction's got 6 games a year in total. Now, there was a skill in the game which called alternate identity, which would allow you to try to infiltrate into the other faction's game. And we were trying to promote this towards Nosferatu, as we wanted them to kind of be independent style faction, but at the same time other players could of course take that skill and roll the dice and see if they could get past the security of that court and infiltrate into it and gain information, etc. What we also did as well is that the location, the asset code of the following month's court for that faction would be made available at that game. So for example, you turn up to your first Camarilla game, during that night, towards the end of the night, we would make public the asset code stroke location for your following game. So when you were next attending your next Camarilla game, you would have the in-character location that it would be at. Now, if this information was to get across to the other faction, what they could do is on your game, they could all turn up. If they had the correct asset code location, they could come and attack your court. So you could have a lovely court, everything's planned out, you've got jugglers, you've got all kinds of stuff going, oh, it's great entertainment. Next thing you know, a group of players come barreling in through the front door and start to attack. And that's what we were looking for. We wanted PvP to be in the game, as in, a lot of LARPs, what happens is when you get into a confrontation, it's predominant of the time it's against monsters. So NPCs that are there to give you some combat kind of fun. And the problem with that is that the monster crew don't really care that they're going to die. And the players know that the monster crews have been statted in a way so that it wouldn't be an unfair fight. So the most reaction is, I'm just going to run in and have some fun. We wanted to add an element of fear into the players, because when it's player versus player, you have no idea what the power level is of those players. We as refs do, but you as a player don't. So you would have that thing where when you were fighting that other player, you would genuinely be having to really think about, should I be engaged in this fight? Do I stand a chance here? Should I be fleeing, etc.? And it adds a new dynamic to that kind of engagement. So we really wanted that in the game. That's why we had two separate factions that within the law are very much opposed to each other. And that's why we had two separate games. So that way, when an attack did happen, it felt real and it felt it would be gritty and all of that. Now, we also had... So... one of the things that we also added in is that how can you get players to fight other players, and even in their own faction, how can you get them to have competition and rivalry, stroke, status, pecking order, all of that? How can you drive that? And fundamentally, it came down to blood. So I personally believe that if there is a resource that all the players in the games use, and you restrict that resource, it means that that resource then comes, it becomes sought after by everybody. So in this case, blood. Players would be able to, there was feeding areas within each of the domains, and they had a health level, which is the health level of that area, and a blood pool. And depending on the health, so if the health was at 100%, you would be able to go down to 75% of the blood pool before any masquerade breaches took place. But if the health level dropped, so did that safe level of blood before masquerade breaches would happen. So the idea behind this was that if your faction took control of an area, then first of all, you had more control over masquerade breaches, and you could have more direct control over the health of that area. Now, that was how we were linking international players in, which I've talked about in another video, to help with these kind of things. But fundamentally, blood was restricted in the game, and we as a ref team and plot team could change the levels. So, to help kind of stimulate a little bit of player versus player. Because the idea is that vampires themselves... there is a social pecking order. And the reason for this is that when you are made into a vampire, you become an alpha predator. You are the top of the food chain. Well, the problem is when you're at the top of the food chain and there's loads of other individuals that are also at the top of the food chain, conflict can start to take place. And what will happen is that those that are at the top wish to protect what they have. And so that would mean that in the social status of how a court would work, both Sabat and Camarilla, if there was restricted blood, then those in station would get that blood first. Those without station would have to earn the blood. And if there was an abundance of blood, then everybody can have it and the status wouldn't really come into it. But when you start to squeeze on that resource, all of a sudden you'll start to see the coteries, status, etc. all start to appear as people are struggling and scrabbling to try to get hold of as much as that resource for them and their friends as possible. And that's what we were trying to push forwards. And players could alleviate that pressure by getting pally with international players that could help to reduce the amount of downtimes required to feed. They could do things to increase the health. They could do things to increase the blood pool. There was all kinds of little bits and bobs international players could do to help alleviate that pressure. But at the same time, it was there. And the important thing is that you have the Sabbat, the Camarilla, and then, as I stated, I wanted a third faction. And to me, that was the city. The city itself is a living, breathing organism made up of your police, your local, your hospitals, the people that live and work there, and all of that jazz. But also the resources that come from outside of the city. So in this case, because it's vampire, you have things like hunters that can come into the city. If there seems to be if there's loads and loads of masquerade breaches start to take place, it will start to draw the attention of hunters, and that will put pressure on both factions. And if the city itself starts to see its health levels dropping, or blood starts to, things start to go down or something like that, the city itself will start to react to it. And what we could use the city for was to basically add balance back into the game. So if one of the factions was to start really taking control, the city would fight back to regain 50% or 51%. The city always had to try to contain or have control of 51%. If it ever lost 51%, it would look to see which faction is taking more control, and it would target that faction. Meaning, if you had the Sabbat and the Camarilla, and let's say the Camarilla had taken 3 of the areas under their control, and the Sabbat had 5, which means they had more blood, etc. It's easy for them to fill everybody up with blood before coming into an attack, whilst the Camarilla were still struggling, trying to make sure everybody had blood. But because that status quo has now been broken, let's say 10 areas and 5 of which have been taken, well, the city no longer holds 51%. So it would utilise its downtime actions, and plot elements would come in that would target the Sabbat because they held more territory than the Camarilla. And that's how we would balance out the game. And I think that's important. If you ever make a game or you're running a project and you think, we're going to put some PvP in it, we want to push the players, you've got to be so careful that what happens is you don't create monsters, which is where you basically PvP takes place, and players take the reward. And because they've taken the resources and reward from the other players, they now hold on to that, which means they're now more powerful than they were the last time. So when they attack again, they're in a much stronger position than they were the first time they attacked. And this cycle will continue until you do something to basically strip those resources back away from those players and put them back into the game. And I've been to a lot of LARPs where this hasn't been put into place, and you can see it. You can see the players that have played there for a few years, that have had some lucky encounters, gained an awful lot of wealth and power, and because of that, they're able to curb stomp you. I'm not going to name the game because I don't think that's fair to do, but there was a game that I attended where there wasn't really plot in the game. It was a large game, so there's loads of people that turned up. We're talking 1,000 plus. The game had been going on for some time, 5 years plus, and there was the way XP worked, etc. You could pretty much make up your own tree/path. And what was happening was that those that were at the top of this tree were able to train others with those abilities that they'd learned, and fast track it as well. So they had the resources to not only expedite another player's development, but also give them very snacky abilities along the way. Also, because they had these players with these abilities and powers, they were able to go around and take resources from other players. And those resources then allowed them to gain more powerful items and gear within the game. And there was nothing in place to stop that from happening until eventually the power base of some of these groups within the game was astronomical, and when you first come in, it's incredibly difficult to compete with that. You feel like you're an insignificant thing, and it's pointless even being there. Now, granted, the group that I was in had our own ways around that. I'll just say Novax, for those in the know, and we were able to gain power, wealth, and influence very quickly by, well, stealing it. And that's how we were able to. These people that thought that they were untouchable weren't. And following the rules of the game for stealing from other players, we were able to gain an awful lot of wealth, power, and influence over a short period of time, by basically just targeting these big behemoth kind of factions, thinking that they were untouchable, and maybe leaving subtle clues that it was some of the other factions that had stolen from them, which caused PvP within the top dogs. Anyway, enough said, but we had some fun with it. But that's not the case with all games. And not all players will have the ability or inclination to want to do that. So it's down to you as the project leads, organisers, developers, whatever you want to call it, the ref teams, to ensure that if there is player versus player in the game, that that you have those checks and balances in place. And that's what we were doing. And that's why PvP caused us so many issues when it came to things like changes in the game development due to other shit that took place. For example, when we went from the Met rules / law to V5, well, the Sabbat aren't really in V5. They are now, but at the time there was no Sabbat book. And we knew that there was going to be big changes to the Sabbat because there'd already been big changes to the Camarilla. I mean, there's no longer Shreknet, for example. That's a huge difference for Nosferatu, especially with the whole, you can't use phones and internet and all that's all been banned. That's a huge like change. So we were concerned that the same thing would happen to the Sabbat. So there was information, though, on the Anarchs. So we basically swapped it from Camarilla and Sabbat to Camarilla and Anarchs. Problem with that being that the Camarilla and the Anarchs aren't really in massive competition. They are. It's definitely in V5 more heated than it was within the Met and V20, but it was still not the same polar kind of opposite rivalries that is Sabbat and Camarilla. Now, that, for those who don't know what Vampire is and are watching this and don't understand what if you just imagine that you've gone from having a neutral faction, a hostile, let's say good guys, neutral, bad guys, and the good guys were the bad guys before, fighting them, and now all of a sudden you've got rid of the bad guys and replaced it with neutral. It just diluted the that kind of conflict, made it a little bit more conversational based, less punchy face. Also, with the loss of international play from the game, we then lost some of the coping things that we had in place to allow, if there was an imbalance between the factions, we just lost one of the tools that was to be utilised to help balance things out again. So there was a hit from that. And then, of course, the actual game itself was, we were looking at it and going, right, with these massive changes, then can we afford to do two separate factions fighting each other, or should we just try to combine it into one game for both factions to attend, like an Elysium? And then, because we used the word Elysium, which, for those who don't know, like a safe space, a place where all factions kind of adhere to the rules. Think of it, if you've ever seen John Wick, when he goes into the hotel and there's a set of rules in that hotel, and even though you're a badass assassin who just killed like 50 people outside, straight away you abide by the hotel's rules. That's an Elysium. It's something that all of the factions adhered to in one way or another, but predominantly everybody adhered to the rules, and that was the Elysium. Problem with that is you can't really fight in Elysium. So the game was getting diluted and muted, and it just felt like the PvP aspect of it was being stripped away, and that caused so many headaches trying to figure out how to put it back in without making it them versus us, meaning players versus the environment, players versus the rest team. We didn't want that. We didn't want the refs to be the PvP element. We wanted it to be player versus player. We wanted the conflict to be between players, not between the monster of the week kind of thing, you know, the 10 o'clock Sabat attack kind of. So yeah, it was really annoying. And this is the kind of thing where when you are running a project, you're going to have these moments where changes take place. And I'm going to go back to a video where I stated about you are in charge of your project, right? You need someone who's in charge, who's running it, who makes the tough decisions and the rest of it. If you are in that position, don't be like me and allow the community and your team to pressure you and push you into making quick fire decisions because you're trying to keep everybody happy. Because decisions that you make can have massive, massive ramifications. And in the case of this, a split-second decision to go, well, we got to stay current, because if we don't stay current with what's happening with Paradox and what's happening out in the kind of material that's being out, we're already out of date. Well, we've got to change. We've got to keep current. We've got to keep relevant. And that decision basically blew the project out of the water, because changing to V5 and not having the resources at hand at the time was a stupid decision. And that's something that you, as a project manager, project lead, whatever you want to call yourself, you have to definitely, before making decisions, think things through. And I know I've already said all this in another video, but I just want to reiterate it, that PvP was going to be absolutely awesome, and we had so many ideas for how we were going to plot lines and how we were going to do things that was going to cause that conflict. Little hidden things like the Nosferatu were actually going to be able to look at other players' forums, so they could have a look at the Toreador forum and scroll through and see all the messages on there and stuff like that. That was awesome. You know, we'd implemented all this on the forum design, and then they got rid of ShrekNet when it went to V5, and that ruined it. You know what I mean? We couldn't do that. And we wanted to allow players to use mobile phones and Google and stuff like that at games. It was really important for puzzle solving and all of that jazz. Well, the Camarilla, they can't use phones anymore, and the internet, because in V5, the Camarillas decreed that that's all banned. So now you had a huge advantage for the other faction, because they could still use all of their electronic devices at the game, whilst the other faction couldn't. And little things like that, fuck me, really annoying. That decision, that split-second decision that was made, blew everything up. But anyway, that's not PvP. So anyway, it's important if you are having player versus player in your game, and I really hope you do, because it will add a huge beneficial element that will make the game fun for everybody, is you ensure that you put those checks and balances in, that you make sure that although you allow player versus player to take place, you never allow a player or a faction to start to dominate and control your game. You need to have a third element in the game that keeps control of that. And be warned, if you turn up with your big powerful NPC, your non-player character run by the ref team, and it walks in and goes slap and takes it all away from those players, they'll leave your game. You need to be clever about how you do it. It needs to be natural. And the only way to describe that is, as they're attacking at the front door, you send somebody around to attack their back door, which means that they have to split their resources. So now they're defending whilst attacking. If you're ever in a situation where you have to defend and attack at the same time, you're literally halving your resources, especially when the enemy attacks you with more force and you're having to defend with greater numbers. It means your attacks are weaker, and in doing so have a much greater chance of failing. So taking that analogy or that scenario and putting it into the vampire universe, if the players that have loads of power go and attack another player's court, then as that attack is about to take place, you warn them that their havens or whatever it is under attack. They're, in theory, in this case, there are police raids taking place, there is things being seized and all the rest of it, and unless they divert some of their forces to deal with this, not only will there be masquerade breaches, but there's also the chance that they're going to lose a lot of their acquired resource as things are seized, companies are put into liquidation, blah, 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 because there's incriminating documentation, whatever. That's to make it vampire-esque, but basically all of a sudden the big bad guys thinking we can rock up and do this have to make a decision. Which one of you lot is going back? And then especially when that person gets back and starts to have some role play with one of the refs to one side, as they start to talk through what's going on, they quickly realise, I'm not going to be able to deal with this all by myself, and so they need to take more resources away from the attacking team to then deal with this situation with their havens, etc. And then that puts the attacking team at risk, especially when it happens to be that night that there are some guests, NPCs for that other faction that have in attendance, which are adding their force to the defense of that faction. All seems a lot more natural, and everybody's still having fun, but now the attacking players are on equal ground with the defenders, and the attacking players that have been taken away are still having great fun because they're dealing with their own little encounter run by another ref team, dealing with mortals, dealing with the police, dealing with the potential of hunters, and having a great time figuring out how they're going to keep all of their resources. And that's how I do it. If when the attacking players turned up, I had 16 NPCs all waiting with baseball bats to beat the shit out of them, it just dilutes it. They'll be like, so we can never win then? You're just going to do this every time, are you? But if you make it feel a little bit more natural, a little bit, especially if you drop hints prior to the attack that there's been some sniffings around their havens or something, it just feels more fun. But yeah, so anyway, player versus player. Definitely put it in your game, but put the checks and balances in, and don't make the same mistake I did, which is make huge changes in the project that then rippled down and completely and utterly destroyed my player versus player kind of plans. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed this. At the end of this video, there's another one that talks about how to play an evil character, something like that. Watch that one. It describes how you, if you're into player versus player, how you could elevate your game and that of everybody around you by being an incredibly fun bad guy. Because bad guys to me in games can be amazing if they're played right and they're not bullying, but they just watch the video. They're talking there about how to be a good bad guy, and I think that's important for those of you like me who like a bit of PvP. So yeah, hopefully you found this video enjoyable. Please share it amongst your community. Like, comment, all of that jazz. Love it. So, and I'll see you all again soon. See you later. Love you all. Bye.